Anyway, welcome to our ARPG lecture. Going forward, what I'm going to be doing is that the second these trailers, or the second that these things are finished encoding, though we will be going up ad-free and uncut for the Patreon supporters. And for everybody else, you are going to have to wait quite a bit for me to get around editing out all the breaks and probably the ads that will be showing up at random points during these presentations. But thank you everybody for coming out, whether you're watching this live or recorded. As I said, for our lecture this month, we're going to be talking ARPG design. One of my favorite, exactly. I should get a third one in the corner there. But we're going to be talking ARPG design, or action role-playing games. One of my favorite genres and a very interesting segment of action and RPG design. As always, I have my little notes ready in the background to go through here, but the RPG genre has been one of the longer ones. We can say it kind of became popularized by Diablo, or the original Diablo. I think that was 94 or 95. It's been a very long time. Of course, the footage that you're seeing over there is from Diablo 2. And ARPGs, unlike the roguelike genre, are a lot easier to define in terms of their design and implementation. When it came to the origins of ARPGs, again, it is a combination of action and role-playing games. Traditionally, up until that point, when we talk about RPGs, they were always done either dungeon crawling style or turn-based. So even if there was any kind of real-time movement, once we got into combat, it was always done in a turn-by-turn format, or characters going based on speed. The general MO of the ARPG, though, is that it is entirely done in real time. There are no turns going on as characters are moving around, fighting, and killing. And with Diablo, we kind of got almost the entire, pretty much got the RPG genre solidified with the very first game, and everybody else has been in some way, shape, or form chasing after Diablo's design. Now, when it comes to the RPG genre, I still remember when it came to Titan Quest, and we'll be having footage of that game in the coming minutes. They basically spelled it out right then and there. What is the core gameplay loop of an ARPG? You fight bad guys, you get loot, you grow more powerful. And that's it. Those three simple phrases is enough to define dozens, if not hundreds of hours of gameplay. And when it works and if it hooks you, this is a genre that does not let its hooks out of you for a long time. And the idea of combining action and role-playing design, we can see that influence spread to other games and genres that we'll be coming back to later on in this lecture. But when we talk about what makes an ARPG, one of the key aspects of it is loot generation or itemization. That's another topic. Again, take a drink every time I say that. But ARPGs have grown to become a very popular subgenre. Again, providing this kind of halfway point between a pure RPG and a pure action game. For myself and for longtime fans, exactly. For the longtime fans, you know that I am not a big CRPG fan. The likes of Skyrim, Fallout, The Witcher, Baldur's Gate, Icewind Dale, you name it, those games just don't really interest me in terms of what I like to play normally. And when we looked at kind of the RPG genre, up until the arrival or the design of ARPGs, it's very much a genre that you already have to be into in order to play them. Again, the majority of the CRPGs that were designed were built heavily on pen and paper or tabletop games, Dungeons & Dragons being, of course, one of the more popular ones. And if you looked at titles such as Baldur's Gate, they basically even define like the monster manual and the D&D information right into the manual itself. So if you enjoy those games, you're going to be enjoying that kind of design. If you didn't enjoy them or have a background, you were going to be very much lost. So the beauty about ARPG games in general was that it basically threw out the whole D&D guide and design. It's basically, you see an enemy, you click on them, you're going to hit. We only need dice rolls to determine that. There's no, fancy calculations. And it also streamlined a lot of the process. Again, you're not playing these games turn by turn. I'm running around throwing fireballs, having my skeletons in the example window, just having a jolly good time. Although that's on hardcore, so it wasn't so happy, because I think I almost died several times during this run. And when it came to ARPG gameplay, so much about was basically making a game for action fans who wanted a little bit more depth and customization compared to other titles. And again, that's one of the major points about ARPG gameplay. A big element of it was trying to, again, everybody was chasing after Diablo. Diablo, and by extension Diablo 2, again, pretty much hit all the major markers of the ARPG genre. And people tried to copy it to some extent, but everybody was trying to chase after Diablo. And the problem was that for the majority of the games that tried to outdo Diablo, they usually failed in either the presentation aspect or the general gameplay. And the one series in the early thousands that managed to either, I would say they were on equal footing to some extent with Diablo, was of course Titan Quest by Iron Lore. When we talk about kind of the first ARPG outside of Diablo to really start to push things forward, we can turn to Titan Quest, developed by Iron Lore. And Titan Quest, to me, I really enjoyed this one, as we began to see kind of the evolution in terms of presentation-wise compared to Diablo and the other games around it. This is when we started to see, instead of just having enemies die in stock animations and they all just, fall down to the ground, this is the first one to have a physics system. So that when an enemy dies, their body will contort and ragdoll and do all that other crazy stuff that we come to know and love. There he goes. It looked like he was doing a little dance there before that guy fell. And Titan Quest was no slouch when it came... There we go. Oh, good. Hello, Mr. Mojo. But Titan Quest was no slouch in the gameplay department. Unlike Diablo, and what became kind of the formation of ARPGs, with having fixed characters or fixed classes, Titan Quest just basically said, you're going to make your own class. And instead gave the player a variety of masteries. Each mastery was a skill tree unto itself, and you could have either one or dual class. So if you wanted to be a range warrior who could also summon minions, you could do that. A spellcaster who was also a tank, why not? And we were pretty much getting as far away from the D&D or tabletop hard rules as we could with the RPG genre. With Titan Quest, one of the things that it did differently, or slightly differently, that I'm surprised not a lot of other ARPGs try to emulate, excuse me, was this idea of the enemies having kind of the loot on them. In the sense that, as we get to itemization next, when an enemy is killed, they'll drop loot that has no relation to that character itself. With Titan Quest, what they did, at least with their base version of it, was you saw an enemy and they have some kind of crazy weapon or they're doing some kind of unusual kind of damage. When an enemy dies, they'll drop that weapon as a part of their loot. And I think they kind of got rid of that as we got further into the franchise, especially with the expansions. Oh man, voice is already dying. That's not a good sign. But the idea, of course, was we're doing more in terms of presentation and presenting the stuff to the player compared to just having characters, walk on an isometric field, hit an enemy, they just do like the same can attack, and we repeat that for 50 to 100 hours. In this one, you can see there's a lot more in terms of particle effects, things exploding, characters flying. The first time you fight a skeleton in Titan Quest was just such a hoot, because you kill the enemy and then the bones just explode in, physics-guided direction there. And this does a great job of kind of giving the player that sense that there's more to this than just running around with stock animations. And presentation would become a bigger point as we enter the last decade with the likes of Grim Dawn, Grim Dawn, Torchlight, Path of Exile, Diablo 3. And there's certainly this kind of argument for just how far do you need to go with presentation. Like, for me, I think it is a major factor, because it gives that sense that you're building this epic character. And I think it's one of the things that I kind of miss out of Path of Exile that we'll talk about when we get to that footage. But ultimately, when it comes to presentation, people are expecting more these days. They want to see, characters react to the world around them. They want, unique enemy fights. It's not just, here's a skeleton, now here's a blue skeleton, and a red skeleton, and a green skeleton. We want, giant enemies like that. When you fight some of the bosses in Grim Dawn, they can take up a portion of the screen due to how big they are. Diablo 3 had, of course, the ball fight. I think it was it Ball? Or whoever was the Act 2 boss, Diablo 3, that was my least favorite guy to fight in hardcore difficulty. And there's plenty of room to do unique things along these lines. Another major point about presentation is that it makes it a lot easier to differentiate enemies from one another. Again, you can have enemies be larger size, different color, have, particle effects swirling around them. It doesn't matter. You just need to do something to break up the same thing again and again. But while these first two sections have been very simple, it's time to get to the complicated point. But it's time to get to the major point for our lecture this time, and that is the lovely word of itemization. Itemization is a key element of ARPG design, and it's something that I think differentiates itself from other action-based or role-playing titles. When we look at most RPGs and action games that feature some semblance of loot, the loot itself is usually hard-coded, meaning that the same fiery war axe is going to drop the same way every time. But with ARPGs, they make use of itemization, or this idea that you are procedurally generating loot. And when we use the term loot for somebody new watching, we're referring to any equipment or items that are dropped, found in treasure chests, earned by quests, boss fights, etc. And this is a major point about ARPG design, because you need to understand, or you need to be able to think about your game not with truly fixed progression. In a typical RPG, as a developer, you know, generally or genuinely speaking, how powerful the player is at any given time. If I'm in an area where the enemies are level 30 to 40, I need to compensate, what a player of comparable level is going to be able to have. With fixed drops or fixed weapons and gear in a shop, you know exactly what the player is going to be able to do at any given moment. In a RPG, however, it doesn't work that way. Because loot is created procedurally, you need to be really careful in not only enemy design and balance, but item design and balance as well. If I design my enemies, for instance, at level 15 to do 800 points of damage, well, if I don't give myself, or if I don't design loot that can survive that, the player's not going to be able to get far. This was one of the big issues with Diablo 3 1.0. When they originally developed the Inferno difficulty, it was not balanced at all. And this was kind of par and parcel due to the auction house system. And what ended up happening was the margin of success in terms of loot to survive was razor thin. You basically needed specific gear or specific modifiers to drop, or you weren't going to win. And one of the things that they did was they kept the scale of gear so far that it basically meant that the chance of you getting something that you could use at level cap was minute. Kind of like this. It was essentially like the attack range that could spawn on a gear could be between 500 and 1200. So if you got the 1200 to drop, well, that's amazing. Also, I think I just killed that boss. What was that, in like 3 seconds? I was doing my whole hand gestures and I just looked over and the boss died. But the point was, if you got that 1200 drop, you're going to be set for Inferno difficulty. Or better yet, you could sell that item and make money. Like I've said, I technically did not pay for Diablo 3. I sold like 3 items and made $120 and got my entire collector's edition paid off. That is the extent, by the way, of me making money off of auction house or digital items. But for the vast majority of people, you are rolling 500, 503, 507. You may get 600. And nobody, and the vast majority of people could not make any progress. And it's time to get to the magical word loot table or phrase. The loot table is essentially a spreadsheet or algorithm the game uses to design every piece of gear that will ever drop in an ARPG. If you don't understand loot tables, you're not going to get itemization and you will never build a good ARPG. And the idea is to imagine a spreadsheet where we go from the most general category for a piece of gear to the most specific. So I'm going to it's time for a little pop quiz for everybody watching this live. If we imagine an ARPG, it's not Diablo, just a game that is built on the ARPG genre, what is the very first category, or most generalized category, that a loot table should be pulling from when designing gear? Yeah, I'm going to make you guys work here. What do you think this is, a YouTube video? So, come on people, can anyone figure this out? I need like a ruler at this point so I can slap the table. Well, nobody has figured it out. So the first thing you needed to define is the level of the loot table. See, this is one of the common misconceptions, that a loot table itself, well, that's not an excuse, Draken. Yes, procedurally, not procedurally. Good, I'm slurring my speech already. Procedurally generated loot is kind of what we think about when it comes to procedural or randomly generated. If we talk about randomly generated gear, typically that means that the game will drop a specific weapon, but it may have very slight variations. So it could be, I will drop 3 swords. They have the exact same names to it, but maybe this sword does 7 to 10 points of damage. This sword does 6 to 8. This sword does 10 to 12. When we talk about procedurally generated, it is designing an entirely new piece of item from these various categories. So the first thing, like I said, is the level. Because you are never designing, it's never one loot table per game. That would be crazy. Then it could basically say, we're going to design a gear that could be literally everything. It could drop a level 1 sword, it could drop a level 99 sword at any given point. And then balance just gets thrown right out the window into one of those hell portals. So the first thing the loot table needs to decide is what level is it going to design gear for. And it does not do it for every level. One of the reasons why the footage is Diablo 3 over there is that its loot table is the most transparent, I feel, of all the ARPGs I've played. And the idea is that every few levels, it will switch to a different loot table. So you have a loot table for levels 1 through, I think it's 1 through 5, 6 through 9, 10 to 16, yep. Oh no, Path of Exile is extensive. I'm talking about how easy it is for somebody new to read what it all does. And don't worry, we'll be talking about Path of Exile really soon in this lecture here. And the idea, of course, is that whatever loot, what probably happened there from Mojo's example, is that the level range may be too high. You want to be kept within a few levels of each other. And then whatever the level range is, that will determine things such as stats, or even what rarities are possible. Some ARPGs don't let legendary or set items drop unless it's at a specific level. That's a big thing Diablo 3 did, that you will not see set items until, I believe, level 60. Although they may have changed that with Reaper of Souls, and set items will only appear at level 70, as well as the ancient variant of it. Now, with that said, what happens is once we've chosen the level, we then start working our way from left to right, in essence, in terms of categories. So the next thing could be the gear type. Or I'm sorry, probably the next thing would be the rarity. Rarity will define, again, what could possibly drop. From there, we go to the type of gear. Sword, boot, chest piece, helmet, shoulder, whatever. And then we start getting into some of the more detailed aspects, such as the modifiers. And the modifiers are, again, all those lovely adjectives that you see on a weapon. The fiery, shocking, war axe of vampirism, plus badger. For some reason, some games have used like badger or something else like that. But every adjective you see added to a weapon or a piece of gear is that modifier. And that adjective is the code, or is essentially the code word for the game when it's deciding what the modifier or perk is going to be. So if I see fiery, that means the game is going to be obviously giving me fire damage. Hey, I don't have a gun to your heads. You guys can leave at any time. Or a +7 gun. And then from those specific modifiers or adjectives, things are then further delineated down into the range. So a fiery war axe could do 6 points of fire damage. It could do 37 points of fire damage. And some games, one of the reasons why the rarity goes before the modifier is that the modifier may also determine the number of the rarity can determine the number of modifiers attached to it. Again, this is often why for many games that make use of ARPG loot generation, that a higher rare item is always going to be better than a higher level item, but has a lower quality or lower rarity to it. Because if you have 5 modifiers attached to a weapon, that gives you a lot more leeway than 3 modifiers. Well, don't you guys have phones? There we go. The circle has been completed there. And when it comes to this kind of itemization, there is a lot that has to go in when it comes to bounds, and why it's so easy for games to screw this up. For instance, for modifiers, do you allow competing modifiers on your weapon? So do I want the fiery, icy, watery crossbow? Some of them, once you've gotten one modifier on, it will lock out similar choices. Some games, and this is one of these Diablo 3 did, was that they put additional conditions into their loot tables to make the gear more specific. So, for instance, one of the more one of the unique things Diablo 3 did was they had a greater emphasis on the class of the character. So that if I'm a warrior, the game is going to tilt the loot tables to drop warrior-related or barbarian-related gear. And what they also did was that the modifiers for that gear were tiered or were tuned for that class. For those of you who did not play the original Diablo 3, one of the things that they did, or one of the more annoying aspects, was that I could be a barbarian whose primary attribute is strength, and I will roll a legendary barbarian weapon that only gives me +2 intelligence. And that is useless. That made that weapon entirely useless due to how the primary attribute worked. And again, all these factors were competing in Diablo 3 for the auction house system. And again, do never forget the auction house of Diablo 3, people, because it ruined so much of that design. And Blizzard lied. Let's get it on record. They lied through their teeth about the auction house affecting the gameplay of Diablo 3. There we go. I'm pissing off Blizzard, so this video should be getting demonetized any second now. Or this stream. And the point is that if you're going to build an ARPG, you need to have a really good itemization system. And when we talk about what makes good itemization, it's also about being able to design items that have unique ways of, or can feel different in the player's hands. Diablo 3's itemization is very laid bare, but it's also very simple. For those of you who didn't play it, another big thing, all the elemental damage in Diablo 3 is worthless. It's just simply numbers for the weapon. Enemies have no resistances. There's no, special procs for lightning or ice. It's just kept very basic. Now, when we look at Diablo 2, Grim Dawn, Path of Exile, and see you later, Draken, there is a big difference between hitting enemy with fire than it is with ice, or with lightning. Or, Grim Dawn got crazy. There's burning, fiery damage, there's a damage over time for ice, which the name completely escapes me at the moment. And you really want your weapons to have a sense of personality to them. That's the beauty of itemization. That, a sword that is lightning spec could be different than a sword that is fire spec. And then when we get to the legendaries, they should be doing something special. Or should that be the new Patreon goal there, Ryu? As I was saying, you want them to legitimately do something different. And some of the better examples of ARPG design, they'll have unique modifiers that can only show up on legendary or epic gear, such as chance for your sword to shoot an icicle. Your armor could explode in thorn damage when you take enough damage. Summon crows when you do an attack. It's all about just giving your items a sense of personality to them. The problem that Diablo 3 ran into, and something that we're going to be talking about when we get to endgame or late game customization, is that the items just kind of devolve. There's no difference between me swinging a sword, as a scythe, as a giant polearm, you name it, in Diablo 3. It's all about the modifiers, but once you get the modifiers that you want, there's no other point for itemization. And that's a key thing you have to watch out for when it comes to these games. That if a weapon is generated that's so good, that if an item is so good that you don't need any more gear, that's also a failure of the loot table. And this is why the loot tables have to be built on different levels. Because eventually, no matter how great that level 10 weapon is, something has to replace it. We've seen some games where I will get a piece of gear at level 20, and I will never need to swap that out until maybe level 60. Which I think actually happened in one of the early versions of Grim Dawn. And Grim Dawn has received extensive patches to their itemization and their loot tables over the 4 years of them being released. You need to have this sense of itemization going with your game. You want the gear to always be progressively getting better. And another thing about this is that it makes it easier for you to bounce, because you can give a general idea of how powerful a player is and how powerful they should be at any given point. If you're not careful, you can run into a situation where a character is just playing all the way through. That was Blizzard calling. They heard what's going on. They're sending the drones now to kill me. So you better enjoy this lecture. This will be our last. That you can have somebody play the game completely well, and they will fail because they didn't get the lucky loot or the right drop when the time comes. And this can lead to very frustrating games when the player can't make any progress because there is essentially it's all up to the loot table at that point. Doesn't matter how great they play if the next great sword is not dropping for them. I will need at least 3 more drinks, I think, by the time this is over. Looks like Diablo 3 is lagging there as well. Now, another big point about the loot table itself is when the loot drops. Some games, and this is another big thing about Diablo 3 and why I chose it as an example, Diablo 3 is very clear about how it wants loot to drop. For some games, they will make it that loot will only drop when a certain condition is met. Typically when you kill a elite or an epic or a super hard boss. Welcome back, Dragon. But typically, when you're designing a loot table for an ARPG, there should be a percentage chance for any rarity to drop. We're talking, when we're talking about set or legendary gear, it could be a 1% drop chance. Oh, my ears are popping now. A 1% drop chance on a normal enemy for a legendary piece to appear. Now, you may be thinking, that sounds like it's never going to happen. But remember, we're talking about 1% for every enemy you're fighting. And you can be typically fighting several hundred enemies in a span of 30 minutes or less. And this gives a chance for anything to happen. And that was one of the best things about Diablo 2's loot table. That it left itself up that while there's still that level transition, I just killed another boss in the span of a second there, that you still could be surprised by what happened. With Diablo 3, however, it basically ran into this case that the only time you were going to get something really good is you had to do a greater rift run, you had to fight a boss, or you had to kill elite minions. And it robbed that game of a lot of the magic of loot tables. And one last point I wanted to bring up, because another way that you can tell when a loot table changes is when the model or the name of the gear is different. So this, going back to, I think, Ryu's point about Path of Exile, they did this really well. What they did was that you have a knife, and then you have, it's a, thief knife. Then it becomes a bronze knife. Then it becomes an assassin's dagger. Then it becomes the Eldritch Blade, or however you want to define it. And what this does is it simply allows a player to see that they are changing the loot table as they level up. So that, yes, you're still finding an axe, but it's a different model of an axe. It's a different chest piece or an armor piece or whatever. And again, this is all a way of defining progress. One second, let me turn my head there. A way of defining progress and giving the player a way to measure it. So as we all know, a key point about these kinds of games is the fashion element. That you go from, very drab pieces of gear to, you have sparkly, shiny gold armor while, orbs are flying around you as you get to full level. But one of the major limitations when it comes to ARPG design is the endgame. And that is going to be our cue to switch some footage up. So, when we talk about some of the limitations of the ARPG genre, it's something that a lot of games have faced. It has to do with the endgame, or late game progression. The problem that a lot of these games have had is that when you are dealing with loot tables and a fixed level cap, there is an inherent end to how far you can go in terms of player progression. And the problem that a lot of ARPGs face is that at some point, the search for loot becomes meaningless. If I'm at max level cap and I have the very best version of this axe, what else is there for me to chase after? You can make enemies harder, yes, but let's say if my attack damage only has a end cap of 50,000 points, then at some point it just devolves into just a lot of just hitting an enemy repeatedly, and it becomes button mashy or just very spammy. Now, one of the things that Path of Exile does really well, that goes above and beyond, is having a very extensive progression system with its passives. You saw that massive skill tree about 10 seconds ago. And and what this does is it provides a secondary form of progression. And actually, we could even say that Path of Exile goes to 3 levels of progression there. Because of the fact that you have the gems as well. The gems level up. You have your passive tree. You have these 3 different forms of progression. And it's all done to give the player something to reach for. With Path of Exile specifically, that skill tree does such a great job of motivating the player that it becomes all-encompassing for their builds as you get to the end game. As I'm sure a few of you who have played the game all the way there can attest to. That it's all about figuring out just exactly how I want my build to synergize with my skill gems, to synergize with the gear itself. And that's something that Diablo 3 just falls, flat on its face with. And to some extent, I think Grim Dawn does as well. Because again, once you hit level cap, there are no more new loot tables. And I never played a platformer or an ARPG. That Josh in the corner is a flat-out liar there. But the problem that Grim Dawn and Diablo both face is that there's nothing meaningful to go for once you get to end cap. Because again, doing 30,000 points of damage or doing 3 points of damage, it's all scale. The problem with a lot of ARPGs that without having some kind of meaningful progression, it just evolves into numbers. This was an issue that I also had with The Division. That with The Division, how I shoot a level 5 sniper rifle is the same as how I shoot a level 30 sniper rifle. An epic one, a common one, it doesn't matter. And the problem is that even if you just throw, 80,000 more variants of that sniper rifle, I'm not changing anything. And this is why itemization is very important. This is why itemization is a very key point about this. Or allowing characters or players to roll new modifiers or chase after something. And can anyone think, besides Path of Exile, of ARPGs that do a really good job of transitioning from mid or beginning or early game to the end game or late game in terms of really good progression or progression models? Because it is very hard to do that right. And it's not something I think a lot of developers think about all that much unless you're really going for a live service. But even then, The Division, I don't think it did that great of a job. And another beauty, is that when you have something that you can just keep on creating new versions or being able to upgrade and have more progression, it gives, again, these weapons a greater sense of personality. Again, it's why itemization is such a key point about ARPG design. And without it, you don't have an ARPG. So one of the big things about the ARPG genre is that it really began to kind of spread out to other genres and other forms of gameplay. Earlier, Jantrovic, I think, asked about first-person RPGs being also considered ARPGs. And this is where things began to get a little bit muddied in terms of the genre. Because this idea of having an action-based game, but also having an RPG layer or wrapper around it, started to become a major aspect of kind of multiplayer and even just AAA games going forward. One of the big examples, of course, is Call of Duty. Call of Duty was the kind of the first-person shooter, not easy to say there, to have an RPG backbone to the multiplayer. The whole idea of leveling, upgrading your guns, the prestige system, the perks system, etc. All this began to show why the ARPG core gameplay loop is so damn addictive. Because it provides a player not only with the means of gaining more power, but to see that take root in the game. You're not just shooting your normal pistol in Call of Duty. You're going to get the fully modified, super fancy camo whatever version of your gun. The same thing with the ARPG. You're not going to use a dagger. You're going to be using the soul-stealing, demonic, fiery lightning dagger of death and vampirism. Vampirism is very important for ARPGs. And we could see this really take root with Borderlands and the idea of a role-playing shooter, which I'm going to be calling now a Schluter. Because I think if you get the right accent on that, it just sounds really great. Yep. And that is one of the things that I found very annoying myself. That many games these days will call itself an ARPG or an RPG as long as there's a leveling curve. Nothing else. And this is why it's very important to have these specific considerations on ARPG design with having procedurally generated loot on top of the character progression and building. Because people have described stuff like Far Cry, Horizon Zero Dawn, Marvel Spider-Man as RPGs, Assassin's Creed as an RPG as well. And this is why I had to be very specific and why I don't consider games like The Witcher or Fallout 3 or 4 or Skyrim to be true ARPGs. Oh, good. Let's throw the ARPG versus CRPG versus JRPG argument here, and we'll be here till 10 o'clock. Because you need these specific elements, because that's what people expect out of the genre. The reason why Borderlands worked so well is that it's very much a first-person shooter, but it has these RPG elements to it. And again, I could have used Borderlands as a really strong example of itemization, both the pros and cons of it, for this section, because they use a very extensive loot table that they have a specific category, not just in terms of the weapon type, but also the manufacturer. The Dahl, what was his name? Torque, and all those other ones, adding additional modifiers to it. And here's a question for you while I take all my cups here and drink as much as I can. Would you consider Borderlands to be a good, average, or poor example of itemization? For me, with Borderlands, I would say I would put on the average side of itemization. And the reason is that it has that same endgame problem. That the loot doesn't differentiate itself enough to afford different strategies. When you get to New Game Plus and Borderlands, it basically comes down to, if you're not using the right gun type to match the enemy, you're not going to have any chance in hell of winning. So if you're not using, like, I think it was acid to robots, no, acid to humans, electric to robots, and I think slag to something else, or slag was like an additional modifier, you weren't going to win. And this is when the loot table, this is the same problem Diablo 3 had in its original version, that the loot table became so wide that it wasn't able to provide you with enough credible options to survive at the endgame. And I would also say that one of the issues I also had with Borderlands was always felt like you would get so much, and this is another big point, I probably should have brought this in with itemization. You also have to be careful about too much in terms of modifiers, because the player needs to be able to understand what piece of gear is better. Like, here, raise your hand if you ever played an ARPG that you just became, like, loot locked. Like, you couldn't decide what to put onto your character. Do I wear the armor that does 16 to 37 points of armor? The one that does 15 to 28 but gives me plus 3% attack speed? The sword that does 27 points of fire damage? Or the sword that does 23 points of fire damage and 3 points of ice damage? This was a problem I ran into with, Van Helsing. The Adventures, the Adventures of, the Grim Adventures or whatever of Van Helsing. I may be confusing names here right now. But what happened with Van Helsing was that I would kill a group of enemies, I would get like 10 different swords, 18 different guns, and I'm just constantly just forced to stop and go, okay, do I want to use this gun that gives me 0.0075 more attack damage? This one that gives me 0.0063 attack speed? This was by the way, the one really good thing about Diablo 3 was they condensed it down to say, okay, every gun or every piece of gear will give you a change in either attack, defense, or life. So I know right away when I look at a sword, an axe, a chest piece, whatever, okay, this is going to give me 10% more attack value. This will give me 800% more attack value. Ooh, that reminds me of another thing about loot tables. Again, with Diablo 3, what they did was that when they changed the expansions, they used radically higher loot tables to give you a difference in terms of progression. This is why when you play Diablo 3, there is a massive jump in power between a level 59 loot table and a level 60 loot table. Oh no, I'm sorry. It was 55 to 60 and then 61 to 66. That 61 to 66 was a huge jump because they were trying to differentiate the expansion content from the end game or the base game content. And this is why you need to be, or this is one, again, some of the challenges of this kind of itemization. That as you start introducing more of these RPG or more of these loot elements to it, that it becomes just a unmanageable mess. Which is also part of the course of the kind when we talk about ARPGs, because all these conversations just kind of intersect into each other. But a new set of I'm not sure I quite understand that. So you're saying, if I understand that right, you like the variance of the different modifiers, fiery, attack speed, lifesteal, whatever, but maybe just have a flat or compound base weapon stat? Or are you just saying just have like one like universal DPS stat on every weapon? Which I think that may be what you're hinting at there. Yeah, you want to make it very clear, because this is one of those cases where more is not necessarily better in terms of ARPG. Yeah, so something like Diablo 3 system there. Yeah, and that again is very important, that you always, no matter how many stats you have on a weapon or a piece of gear, there should be something that just sums it up. That yes, this weapon may have 15 different modifiers on it, but in the end of the day, it may make me do 30% less damage. That makes it a lot easier to design. And that was one of the things that Grim Dawn did, Titan Quest did, and so on. Yeah, so like if I have a... That is very interesting. We may be getting into tangent territory here. One of the things that Grim Dawn does, which if Getter is watching this right now, I'm sure he's going to agree with me or he's going to comment on, that so much of the synergy between weapon and player has to do with the various masteries. So that if, for instance, I'm using a mastery that grants me bonus fire damage, I would want to have weapons that will synergize with that, and components, and the the belt and the accessories. And the problem I think that game kind of had was that there, and actually, please correct me if I'm wrong on this one, I don't know if when it does a calculation, it takes into account your class masteries or your elemental bonuses as well. Because it does get a little bit confusing for new players, that just because a weapon has higher base attack, a weapon that has more bonuses towards your specific element would ultimately be better. Oh, and that's also why percentage-based modifiers are very key, especially when it comes to ARPGs. Oh god, that just made me realize my whole organization is thrown off. There's one other category that we need to talk about, and that is skill systems. Skills in ARPGs are a very big aspect of it, and in fact, I'm going to switch footage. And now for a quick shout out to our current Game Wisdom supporters and sponsors. Going forward, all Patreon supporters will get early access to our videos. And if you'd like to continue this discussion on game design, be sure to check out our Discord channel, linked down below. If you're looking for more wisdom about game design, be sure to check out my latest offering of books, 20 Essential Games to Study, aimed for first-time developers and students looking for some inspiration for their upcoming games, and Game Design Deep Dive Platformers if you're interested in anything regarding 2D and 3D platforming design. They're both available in print, digital, and wherever books are being sold. One final category that I want to touch on in terms of ARPG design that I almost missed, and that is designing skills. Skill design is not often something that we talk about in terms of ARPGs. We spent the better part of an hour, let me see, oh no, we're over an hour at this point, on itemization alone. But skills are an essential part because this defines your character's utility. Again, everybody can use the same gun or the same sword, but, my necromancer can summon an army of skeletons. My barbarian can jump into the battle and do his little whirlwind spin attack. And you need to think about how your skills intersect with the itemization, as well as just with the general playability. And this to me is another aspect that separates kind of the good, the bad, and the amazing ARPGs. Because it's not just about coming up with skills, it's about presenting them. Like I said, one of the great things about Titan Quest was this is when we started to see you don't just throw a fireball and the enemy falls over dead. You hit the enemy with a fireball, he gets flung 30 feet in the other direction. And this is, I think, one of the things about why I like Grim Dawn overall better than Path of Exile, which them's is fighting wars, I guess, as the expression goes. That with Path of Exile, because all the skills are locked to the gems and not really class specific, they're far more generalized in their approach and presentation. In Grim Dawn, yep, exactly, I knew that was going to happen. In Grim Dawn, when I use a crazy skill as the engineer, or wherever he was, wherever that mastery was, we get, I throw a Molotov cocktail that explodes. If you remember when we played Grim Dawn the other night, when I finally got the Death Ray, like all of a sudden my character goes from, smacking enemy with their sword to just going, Kamehameha, and, blasting an entire crowd of enemies and melting them. And it just gives a little bit more in terms of customization options. With the Division over there, one of the problems they ran into is that there's very few in terms of skills or customization that you have access to. I think you can have any two gadgets at any time. Like I just shot my goo gun or my whatever it was at the enemy. And the problem, or what makes this very important from an ARPG standpoint, is that your skills and by extension your class really need to stand alone in order to get somebody to use them. And there's also the entirety of balancing when it comes to skills as well. Because one of the things, and I actually brought this up in a tweet, and thinking about that tweet made me remember this topic, is that one of the things that they've done in order to try and get more utility is move away from flat damage or flat number skills to percentage-based skills. What that means simply is that in the old days, when you use a skill in a game, it will say, this weapon or this fireball will do 20 to 37 points of damage. If I level it up, it goes now 42 to 63. Now, as we're seeing here, the idea is there's nothing wrong with that. But as we all know, as characters or as the game scales up the enemies as well as the leveling and the loot, flat damage skills will quickly lose their utility. Doing 500 to 700 points of damage at the skill cap doesn't necessarily work if enemies now have 30 to 70,000 points of health. So what they've done is that they've moved to a percentage-based system. So now we'll say this skill will do 12% fire damage based on your attack. Or the skill will be modified based on your specific attribute. And as we go up, the percentage will go up as well. This way, it grants more utility to that skill, and it means that no matter what your level is, if that skill is going to do 27% of what your raw attack value is, it's going to still remain viable, compared to, again, something that has a flat level cap. And in my opinion, I think that is the preferred way of designing skills these days. is based or has certain modifiers based on your block chance. Or you could have additional modifiers on a skill based on other stats. So you could have a spell that, let's say, pulls from both your attack hit plus a specific element, or plus a 2-hit chance, and etc. and etc. But this is again why some of the more other aspects or games that have been inspired by ARPGs tend to have some problems with them, is that their skills just don't seem to pop as much. Borderlands is another big example of this. In Borderlands, every class gets only one specific class skill, and the rest are passive perks. And it means that by the end cap, or by the end game, everybody just genuinely seems to play the same. And to Zach's point, that's another really good thing. That if you're going to keep the player to be motivated, they have to be constantly given new things to go for. Again, the allure of loot only goes so far. This is why skills are such a big deal. That at level 5, I may only be able to shoot a fire arrow out of my bow. At level 30, I could be doing like artillery shots that rain down from above and do massive damage. This, to me, is one thing that Diablo 3 did really well. That every level in Diablo 3 has a unique reward to it. And it's a lot harder, I think, than it sounds to be able to spread your reward curve or your progression loop out over 70 levels. But it works. The Division is so damn boring because of that. And as we know, in the Division, the real game begins at level 30. But you're going to be tired of the game, or you're probably going to run out of new stuff by level 8. So, again, saying at level that I only gain 30 points more damage, 100 points of health, doesn't really do anything for you. Yep. And that's also where I think Grim Dawn kind of fails as well. That if you're just pumping points into a mastery or to a skill you already have, it's still not changing things. Again, having my skeletons do 30 points more damage, I'm still summoning skeletons. It's not changing things. And again, I think this is also the other reason about with Grim Dawn. Or I'm sorry, not with Grim Dawn, with Path of Exile, which Ryu will now unsub again. That the skill gems just don't have that same, dopamine triggering as the same thing as leveling up and getting a new skill in Diablo. And I would say that Diablo, in terms of the leveling mechanic or the leveling progression, is the best of the ARPGs because of that. Yeah. And again, I would say that Path of Exile has the best late to end game progression out of all the ARPGs that we've played. So pretty much my dream ARPG would be then, give me the itemization of Grim Dawn, the sheer spectacle and variety of skills as Diablo, with the late and end game customization and long-term, pathing and progression of Path of Exile. Again, the beauty about Path of Exile is that you have multiple forms of progression all interlaid on each other to give it that sense of growth. Great. I actually need to go eat dinner soon. I'm starting to feel my blood sugar dropping, which seems to be on point about all these lectures. Torchlight, I think, would be very interesting. Like, if you remember, Rob really loved Torchlight, and I think my problem was I didn't really play Torchlight 2 until after I played Grim Dawn. And it's kind of like Grim Dawn is, the better version of that. And again, you have to... The beauty about ARPG design, what makes the best ones work, that's all these elements combined. itemization, character classes, skills, and all that utility and the late game progression to make them very compelling. And again, the core gameplay loop, fight enemies, get gear, grow in power, when those three things are on point, it will keep people invested for hours and hours, and as Zach said, over 1,000 hours. And again, I have at this point, if I were to combine like all the hours I've spent playing ARPGs, I've got to be hitting like 3,000 to 4,000 hours plus of all of them, from Diablo to Grim Dawn to so on. I wonder how many hours I have in Grim Dawn at this point, because I keep creating new characters, so it just keeps going and going. Let's see. The answer, according to this, is 262. I think part of that is to this day, I don't think I've really taken a character to end cap or to end game, because I always get distracted with a new character, and I'm like, I'm going to play that one, or that character dies in hardcore, and then we gotta restart over again. But again, this is the beauty, and this is why, as a somewhat of a tangent, more ARPG or more RPG systems have been brought into kind of non-RPG based games, because that sense of persistent progression and that kind of scaling will keep people invested. This is why, if Call of Duty didn't have its RPG leveling system, it would be nowhere near as popular. I can guarantee you on that one. And it's why we saw more other FPSs have those elements to them. And when all this works, it will keep people just again and again and again, why they've become a very popular form of live service. But with that said, we're going to switch up our footage for our conclusion. So, to wrap things up for our lecture here. Oh yeah, Chronicon. We need to replay that game when it hits 1.0. The ARPG genre originally started simply as a merging of action and role-playing based games. And since then, and with the rise of Diablo and Grim Dawn and so on, it has become a way of giving games a lot more in terms of replayability and customization. And it has also been proof positive of how the RPG leveling and progression systems can be applied to other genres. And we have seen that influence in everything from Call of Duty to Dark Souls to even kind of the AAA machine of having leveling and loot and gear in their games. And whether they work or they don't, being able to give the player a secondary form of progression has done so much to elevate these games. Now, you do have to be careful, though, and this could maybe be its own topic in of itself, but how much does the RPG factor into the action? Because this is a very big point about ARPG design, that the more the action will supersede the RPG means that more action-based players are going to enjoy it. Conversely, if the RPG elements are more required, it's going to be more for them. This is one of the things I think that kind of hurts a lot of RPGs that are trying to be more action games, in my opinion. And why something like The Witcher and Fallout and Skyrim don't hook me the same way as something like Grim Dawn, Dark Souls, and etc. That, for me, I like games that have more of the action elements, more about the player's skill, with the RPG supplementing it, rather than being more of a pure RPG, and my skill or my general play doesn't really matter as much. Now, ARPGs like Grim Dawn, or pure ARPGs, kind of cheat in this regard, because obviously they are about the RPG factor in play. But there's a greater sense of depth to the min-maxing, to the customization, what gear I use, and how I build my character, compared to what we see from, again, like the AAA market trying to have late RPG systems. And here's another complaint. Raise your hand if this bothers you. When AAA games say they are RPGs because they have random drops that do absolutely nothing to the general gameplay of that title. So it's like, you're going to get this epic drop that your gun will do 2.37% more damage, but only to flying enemies, and you have to be jumping in the air for that to proc. This is one of the things that kind of drove me crazy about Control. So here's our final controversial question for this lecture. Is the Monster Hunter franchise considered an ARPG? It's got loot, it's got drops, but it still has fixed gear progression. And if I say anything bad about Monster Hunter, Ryu will unsub again. Ooh, an ARPG brawler. Speaking of which, did anyone play the game? I can't remember the name of it. There was I think it was a Korean or Chinese-based free-to-play action game that also had like MMO and ARPG design to it. Vindictus, yes, that's the one. That one I remember really well. Yep, and we've seen so many of these games. I'm gonna send Ryu off as well. That, I don't know, I would say Monster Hunter is an action game that has a strong ARPG layer. Victor Vran, I would say maybe like Victor Vran and Monster Hunter may be very close siblings in terms of their design. That it is an RPG, but the gear is so defining above all else that if you remember in Victor Vran, they have specific ways of how a shotgun plays compared to a pistol or to something else. I remember the mechanics, not the name. And actually, for reminding me of Victor Vran, we're going to switch to that footage. Something like Victor Vran, to me, I think is one of the most forward-thinking or more unique ARPGs that I've played. And the big reason for that was that the developers made city builders. They didn't make an ARPG. And Victor Vran... yes, the Golden Keys. Victor Vran, I think, occupies a very similar area as Monster Hunter. That it is predominantly an action-based game, but there is a strong RPG layer on top of that. And your weapons are essentially your class. There have been other ARPGs that have done that, and I cannot remember them off the top of my head. But as I was saying, with Victor Vran here, your skills that you see at the bottom of the screen, so I'm trying to get my finger pointing in the right direction, differ based on the weapon that you're using. The same thing as your options that you have in Monster Hunter, whether you use the hunting horn, the switch axe or switchblade, etc. there. And there's a lot. Part of your game, yes. And again, this all is about this concluding aspect of ARPG design. That the big thing about ARPGs... What the hell? I'm getting a tent ads now? Half of these streams, or half of these videos is me cutting out my reactions to these advertisements. That what makes the ARPG genre, or the big thing about the RPG design, has been giving action-based games more RPG elements, or giving RPGs more action design to them. And it's really opened up the door in terms of progression, and again it's also been a major way of getting away from the pen and paper design and making things so abstract that it becomes kind of hard for new players to parse what's going on. Again, we don't need to stop and roll dice in a game like Victor Vran. I roll up to an enemy, and I shoot my shotgun, we're doing massive damage. The same thing goes for where the RPG layer falls in terms of whether or not the abstraction works at play, when I attack versus when the actual hit goes in. This is a big point about the difference between Borderlands versus something like Skyrim or Fallout. That in Skyrim, when I slash my sword, in Fallout, I shoot my gun, the game will use the RPG layer to abstract where that bullet hits, if that bullet hits, how much damage it's going to do, does the enemy's defense counter it, does it count as a critical hit. In Borderlands, it basically goes like this. I aim my gun, I shoot. Is my cursor on that enemy's head? Then it's going to be a headshot. If that headshot's a critical point, I do critical damage. There we go. But the point is that the abstraction works at different layers based on whether or not you're focusing on the action side versus the RPG side. And that is something you need to think about as a developer when you're trying to build any kind of ARPG based game. Is this a game that's going to be focused more on action based elements, shooter elements, etc.? Or is it going to be focused more on the RPG layer, the character building, gear, itemization, etc.? So this will be our ending question for those of you watching this live or recorded. Can you think of, or what kind of ARPGs or this kind of design do you prefer? Do you prefer the action games that have more role-playing elements, or the role-playing games that have more action elements? Because you need to consider that when you're designing your game. Because if somebody wants to be more action-oriented, they're not want to be bogged down by so much loot. If they're more about the RPG side, they don't want Twitch skills to be the major factor. And it'll be curious to see how more of these games go forward. For instance, with Bloodborne, I didn't like that skill gem system all that much. I felt it was a system that just didn't have as much of an impact on the game as it should have. Whereas something like Remnant, I wanted more ARPG design on top of Remnant because the core gameplay was so great that I wanted to have more control over the customization. And I'm going to be really interested to see if we get a Remnant 2, what they're going to do with that, and if From Software will return to randomized or procedurally generated loot in the future. But I am running on fumes as always for these casts or for these design lectures, and it's time for me to refill up. So, thank you everybody for watching this. If you're watching this live, for the Patreons, you'll be getting this ad-free and uncut pretty much the second that this is done encoding. For everybody else, I got a whole lot of encoding or a whole lot of editing to do. I'll be back later for our game stream, and we'll have to pick another design lecture topic for the future. But come back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Have a great night, everybody, and I'll see you all next time. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoy things, be sure to do all the liking and subscribing that the kids are doing these days. Check out our Discord channel link down below where we hang out and chat game design, and come back later tonight for our regular streamings. But that's it, and tune in for more great content here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games.